The engine was already coughing when Second Lieutenant William Roach broke through the clouds. November 7, 1943. Strong headwinds over the English Channel had eaten through his fuel far faster than expected. Inside the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt, Roach watched the gauges sink toward empty as the massive radial engine began to sputter. Ahead, through the gray haze, an airfield appeared. It looked right. Grass runway, familiar layout, no flak, no movement. England lay somewhere beyond it, close enough to imagine, too far to reach. Roach had seconds to decide. He brought the Thunderbolt down gently, the heavy fighter rolling across the grass exactly as it had done so many times before. A ground vehicle approached. Roach followed, relief setting in as he shut down the engine. Then he noticed the markings, black crosses on nearby aircraft, German soldiers moving toward him, rifles raised, faces calm, certain. In that instant, Roach understood his mistake. His war's aids. Combat pilot was over. But for the men now surrounding his cockpit, the war was about to reveal something far more unsettling, something they had never expected to learn from an American fighter. To the Luftwaffe, the aircraft that had landed by mistake was nothing special. They had been fighting the P-47 Thunderbolt for months. Since the spring of 1943, German pilots had encountered it, escorting American bombers over France and Western Germany. Their verdict came quickly and confidently. The Thunderbolt was enormous, far larger than any single-engine fighter Germany flew. Heavy, overbuilt, at low altitude it climbed poorly, turned slowly, and felt sluggish in close combat. Against the nimble Bf-109 or the sharp-handling FW-190, it seemed ill-suited for the kind of aerial fighting German pilots valued most. Combat reports reflected that belief. Thunderbolts avoided turning battles. They refused to engage in tight dogfights. When pressed, American pilots often rolled inverted and fled straight down instead of fighting it out. To experienced Luftwaffe aces, this looked like hesitation, a lack of confidence, perhaps even fear. The conclusion seemed obvious. This was an inferior fighter, designed by engineers who prioritized size and brute force over finesse and aerial skill. But buried in those same reports were details that didn't fit the story. Pilots noted that Thunderbolts were almost impossible to catch once they entered a dive. They complained that the aircraft absorbed punishment that would destroy a German fighter. Hits that should have been fatal barely slowed it down. Engines leaked oil, control surfaces were shredded, wings were torn open by cannon fire, and yet the aircraft kept flying. Again and again, damaged P-47s escaped, limping back toward England when logic said they should have fallen. German pilots also took note of the Thunderbolt's firepower. 8 heavy machine guns, firing in a single concentrated burst, produced a volume of fire unlike anything they faced from Allied fighters before. When American pilots chose to engage, the effect was sudden and devastating. Individually, these observations were brushed aside. German confidence in their aircraft and in their doctrine remained intact. The Thunderbolt was big, crude, inelegant, a bad fighter. That belief would hold, right up until the moment German engineers stopped guessing and began measuring. And for the first time, the Luftwaffe would be forced to confront what the Thunderbolt actually was, not in combat reports, but in cold, undeniable detail. As 1943 wore on, encounters with the Thunderbolt became more frequent and more unsettling. German pilots began to notice patterns they couldn't quite explain, even if they refused to fully acknowledge them. Thunderbolts that should have been easy kills were not falling. Fighters that took direct hits from 20mm cannon fire kept flying. Pilots reported seeing American aircraft return west trailing smoke, oil streaming from engines, chunks missing from wings, yet still under control. Any German fighter in similar condition would have been lost. The Thunderbolt seemed to absorb punishment in a way that defied experience. There were other inconsistencies. German pilots found that attacking from above was dangerous. Diving after a Thunderbolt was almost always a mistake. Once the American fighter rolled over and went down, it accelerated beyond pursuit, plunging into speeds that forced German pilots to break off or risk structural failure. Time and again, engagements ended the same way. Brief contact, sudden violence, then the Thunderbolt was gone. And still, the conclusion did not change. The Luftwaffe believed these outcomes were the result of circumstance, not design. American pilots were cautious, their aircraft were overbuilt, their tactics unsophisticated. German skill and maneuverability would always prevail, if only the fight stayed on German terms. What the Luftwaffe failed to recognize was that the Thunderbolt had never been meant to fight on those terms at all. By late 1943, as American bombers flew higher and deeper into occupied Europe, aerial combat was shifting upward toward altitudes where German engines lost power, where climb rates suffered, and where endurance mattered more than elegance. The Thunderbolt thrived there. German pilots were sensing the change, even if they could not yet articulate it. Combat reports grew more cautious. Pilots were warned not to chase diving P-47s, not to assume damage meant a kill, not to underestimate an aircraft that refused to behave as expected. But warnings were not explanations. That changed on November 7, 1943. For the first time, the Luftwaffe did not have fragments to study, or gun camera footage, or pilot impressions clouded by combat stress. They had a complete Thunderbolt, fuel system intact, engine untouched, armament loaded, every system preserved exactly, as it had left an American factory. This time, there would be no assumptions, only measurements. As the aircraft was prepared for transport to Rechlin, German engineers began to understand that the Thunderbolt might not be a bad fighter after all. It might be something far more troubling. It might be a clue, pointing toward a kind of war Germany was no longer equipped to fight, and once that realization began to form, it could not be undone. The Thunderbolt did not remain in France for long. Within days of its capture, the aircraft was stripped of its American markings, repainted with German crosses, and placed under constant guard. This was not treated as a trophy, it was treated as evidence. Orders came quickly. The fighter was to be sent east to Rechlin, Germany's premier aviation test center, where the Luftwaffe dissected its enemies with scientific precision. Rechlin was where illusions went to die. Here, captured aircraft were not judged by reputation or rumor. They were flown, timed, weighed, photographed, dismantled, and measured down to the smallest component. British, Soviet, and French designs had all passed through these hangars. None had ever truly unsettled German engineers. The Thunderbolt arrived quietly. At first glance, it confirmed expectations. The aircraft was enormous for a single-seat fighter, broad wings, thick structure, an airframe that seemed to value strength over grace. To German eyes, it looked inefficient, almost wasteful. That impression did not last. When technicians opened the cockpit, they found complexity bordering on excess. Gauges filled the instrument panel. Controls operated systems German pilots were accustomed to managing manually. Levers existed whose purpose was not immediately obvious. This was not a cockpit designed for constant adjustment and improvisation. It was designed to manage itself. The test pilot assigned to the aircraft was Hans-Werner Lersch, one of the Luftwaffe's most experienced evaluators. By this point in the war, Lersch had flown dozens of foreign aircraft. Few surprised him. The Thunderbolt did. Before flying, Lersch spent hours on the ground, studying the controls, experimenting carefully, trying to understand an aircraft without manuals, without instructions, without help from its creators. Even the engine start procedure demanded patience. When the massive Pratt & Whitney radial finally came to life, the sound was different from anything Lersch was used to. Not sharp, not strained, a deep, controlled rumble that suggested power held deliberately in reserve. Taxiing revealed weight, no surprise there. The aircraft felt heavy, reluctant to move quickly, exactly as German pilots had reported. On the runway, the takeoff run was long, longer than expected. Everything about the Thunderbolt on the ground reinforced German assumptions. Then, Lersch pointed the nose upward. As the aircraft climbed, instruments behaved in ways German engineers did not expect. Power did not fall off with altitude, it stabilized. Then, gradually, it increased. By the time the Thunderbolt reached higher altitudes, something became unmistakably clear. This aircraft was not revealing its secrets at ground level. It had been designed for a different battlefield altogether, and Rechlin was about to discover just how different that battlefield was. Below 15,000 feet, the Thunderbolt behaved exactly as the Luftwaffe expected. Hans Werner Lersch found the aircraft heavy in the turns, slow to respond, reluctant to climb. In this regime, the P-47 confirmed every German assumption. Any competent pilot in a Bf-109 or an FW-190 would have the advantage in sustained maneuvering combat. If the evaluation had ended there, the verdict would have been final. But it did not. Lersch continued to climb. As altitude increased, German engines were supposed to weaken, power was expected to fade, throttle response to soften, performance to decline. This was a fundamental reality of piston-engine combat aviation. The Thunderbolt ignored it. Somewhere above 20,000 feet, the aircraft changed character completely. The turbo supercharger, driven by exhaust gases rather than engine power, came fully alive. While German fighters struggled to breathe in the thin air, the P-47's engine continued producing full-rated power. Manifold pressure held steady. Acceleration did not diminish. At altitudes where Luftwaffe fighters were operating at a fraction of their sea-level output, the Thunderbolt was still strong. Lersch advanced the throttle and felt the aircraft surge forward, an unsettling sensation in a machine this large. The heaviness remained, but it no longer mattered. The Thunderbolt was not trying to outturn its opponents, it was overpowering them. To test its limits, Lersch rolled the aircraft into a steep dive. The acceleration was immediate and violent. The P-47 passed through speeds German. Pilots avoided as a matter of survival. Control forces stiffened dramatically as airflow compressed around the airframe. The aircraft pushed toward the edge of what was then barely understood, compressibility effects that could tear lesser fighters apart. Yet the Thunderbolt held. Recovering from the dive required strength, both hands on the controls, but the aircraft responded. It did not shudder, it did not lose authority, it climbed away intact. Then came another surprise. Despite its size and weight, the Thunderbolt's roll rate was exceptional. Faster than the Bf-109, faster even than the FW-190, an aircraft celebrated for its rolling ability. The combination of rapid roll and unmatched dive speed created a tactical reality German pilots had sensed but never fully understood. At high altitude, a Thunderbolt in trouble did not need to fight. It could simply leave. Lersch ended the flight with a clear conclusion. German pilots had been judging the Thunderbolt in the wrong airspace, at the wrong altitude, by the wrong standards. This was not a poorly designed fighter. It was a fighter built for a battlefield Germany was steadily being forced into, one where altitude, power retention, and survival mattered more than elegance. And now that battlefield belonged to the Americans. Once the flight testing ended, the real examination began. At Rechlin, German engineers did what they trusted most. They took the Thunderbolt apart. Panels were removed, systems exposed, components laid out, photographed, weighed, and cataloged. Nothing was assumed. Everything was measured. What they found was not revolutionary design. It was something far more disturbing. At the heart of the aircraft sat the Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder radial engine of enormous size and power. German engineers were familiar with powerful engines. They had built some of the finest in the world. But as the Thunderbolt's engine came apart piece by piece, unease began to replace curiosity. The materials were exceptional. Forged aluminum pistons of consistent quality, sodium-cooled exhaust valves designed to survive extreme heat, a crankshaft machined from high-grade alloy steel that German metallurgists recognized instantly and knew they could no longer produce in sufficient quantities themselves. There were no signs of compromise, no substitute materials, no shortcuts, no evidence of a design simplified to cope with shortages. This engine had been built exactly as its designers intended. Precision was everywhere. Surface finishes were smooth and uniform. Tolerances were tight across every major component. Magnetos used materials that had become scarce in Germany by 1943. Spark plugs, incorporated ceramics of a quality German industry, struggled to maintain under wartime conditions. Even the fuel and ignition systems displayed a level of reliability German engineers associated with laboratory equipment, not frontline combat. Aircraft expected to endure vibration, cold, heat, and battle damage. The same story repeated itself throughout the airframe. Armor plates surrounded the cockpit, forming what American designers called an armored bathtub. Bullet-resistant glass protected the pilot from head-on fire. Critical systems were shielded with additional protection, adding weight German designers would normally avoid. Yet the Thunderbolt carried it without apology. Maintenance access revealed another philosophical divide. Large panels allowed mechanics to reach major components quickly. Systems were laid out logically, designed to be serviced in the field, under pressure, by crews working in poor conditions. This was not an aircraft built for elegance. It was built for endurance. German engineers began to understand that the Thunderbolt was not a collection of clever ideas held together by ingenuity. It was the product of an industrial system capable of executing a complex design exactly as specified, again and again, at scale. Nothing in the aircraft suggested desperation. Nothing hinted at scarcity. Every part spoke of abundance, and that realization was more unsettling than any single performance figure. Because it meant the Thunderbolt was not exceptional. It was standard. And Germany was now facing an enemy for whom this level of engineering was simply routine. If the engine unsettled German engineers, the turbo supercharger disturbed them. They understood the theory perfectly. German aviation research had explored exhaust-driven supercharging before the war. Wind tunnel studies, test benches, experimental installations, none of this was new. On paper, the advantages were obvious. At high altitude, a turbo supercharger could maintain full engine power long after conventional superchargers failed. The problem was never knowledge. The problem was execution. As engineers traced the Thunderbolt system from front to back, the scale of what the Americans had built became impossible to ignore. Exhaust gases from all 18 cylinders were collected and routed through insulated ducting that ran the length of the fuselage. These gases drove a turbine spinning at extreme speed, which in turn powered a centrifugal compressor, forcing dense air back into the engine. Between the turbine and the engine sat an intercooler, reducing air temperature, increasing efficiency, preventing detonation. Every element had to survive vibration, combat stress, and temperature extremes, ranging from bitter cold at altitude to searing heat near the engine and exhaust system. And every element worked. What shocked German engineers was not the presence of the system, it was how complete it was. Automatic regulators controlled boost pressure and turbine speed. The pilot did not need to manage it constantly. The system adjusted itself, maintaining power smoothly and reliably without demanding constant attention in combat. This level of automation was rare in German fighters, where pilots manually balanced throttle, mixture, and boost in a continuous effort to extract performance. The Thunderbolt removed that burden, but the deeper problem lay beneath the metal. The turbine blades required heat-resistant alloys Germany could no longer produce in volume. The ducting demanded precise manufacturing and perfect sealing. The control systems relied on components that had to function flawlessly, flight after flight, without failure. German engineers knew what it would take to build such a system. They also knew they could not. Not in 1943, not with bombed factories, not with material shortages, not with skilled labor disappearing into the front lines or replaced by forced workers. And then came the most unsettling realization of all. This turbo supercharger was not experimental. It was not reserved for elite units or special missions. It was installed on every Thunderbolt. Thousands of aircraft all built this way, all leaving American factories as complete, fully realized machines. For German engineers at Rechlin, the conclusion was unavoidable. They were not facing a technological trick. They were facing an industrial reality. The Thunderbolt's greatest weapon was not speed or altitude or firepower. It was the fact that its most complex system was ordinary, produced at scale without compromise by a nation whose factories could do what Germany's no longer could. And in that moment, the Luftwaffe's problem stopped being tactical. It became mathematical. The Luftwaffe did what it had always done when confronted with a new enemy aircraft. It wrote instructions. Based on the data gathered at Rechlin, tactical bulletins were compiled and distributed to frontline fighter units. They were precise, professional, and technically sound. Pilots were warned to engage Thunderbolts below 15,000 feet whenever possible, where German fighters still held advantages in climb, rate, and turning performance. They were told never to chase a diving P-47, no matter how tempting the opportunity appeared. The Thunderbolt would simply accelerate away, pulling German aircraft into speeds they could not safely follow. They were instructed not to assume a damaged Thunderbolt was finished. Experience had shown that these aircraft could absorb punishment far beyond what German fighters could survive. Attacks had to be pressed home aggressively, with sustained fire, rather than broken off after a few hits. On paper, the guidance was correct. In practice, it changed very little. Even when German pilots followed the recommendations perfectly, the strategic balance did not shift. Every Thunderbolt damaged or destroyed was replaced almost immediately. American production lines delivered new aircraft in numbers Germany could no longer comprehend, let alone match. German pilots, by contrast, were becoming irreplaceable. Fuel shortages reduced training hours, combat. Losses thinned the ranks of experienced aces. Young pilots arrived at the front with minimal preparation, flying increasingly inferior machines against an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with each passing month. The Thunderbolt itself was only part of the problem. It was supported by a logistics system that delivered fuel, ammunition, spare parts, and replacement aircraft with relentless efficiency. When a unit took losses, it was reinforced. When an aircraft was damaged, it was repaired or replaced. Germany could not say the same. By late 1943, Luftwaffe pilots understood the truth even if they rarely spoke it aloud. They were not losing because they lacked knowledge. They knew how to fight the Thunderbolt. They knew where it was weak and where it was strong. What they lacked was time and numbers. No tactical refinement could overcome an opponent who could afford to lose aircraft, pilots, and engines and replace them faster than Germany could respond. The Thunderbolt had exposed that reality with brutal clarity. It did not need to be unbeatable. It only needed to be numerous. And in that arithmetic, Germany was already losing. By the winter of 1943, the Luftwaffe no longer argued about what the Thunderbolt was. They argued about how many there were. At Rexlin, engineers and intelligence officers began placing the aircraft in a wider context, comparing not just performance, but production. And it was here, in the numbers, that the final argument collapsed. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine that powered the Thunderbolt was not rare. By the end of the war, American industry would produce well over 100,000 of them. One engine type built in quantities that exceeded Germany's entire production of combat aircraft engines combined. Germany's most advanced radial engine, the BMW 801, would never reach even half that number, and the engine was only the beginning. American factories were producing aircraft on an industrial scale Germany could not approach. By 1944, the United States was building nearly 100,000 aircraft a year, fighters, bombers, transports, trainers, entire air forces flowing from assembly lines that ran day and night. Germany, despite desperate efforts, never came close. American aluminum production alone exceeded Germany's total output. Individual American steel plants outproduced entire German industrial regions. Aircraft factories operated on moving assembly lines, while German plants still relied largely on batch production methods, vulnerable to disruption and bombing. The Thunderbolt was one product of that system. So were the B-17 Flying Fortress, bristling with turbo-supercharged engines and defensive firepower. The P-51 Mustang, combining American manufacturing with British engine design. The P-38 Lightning, complex, unconventional, and produced anyway, because American industry could afford complexity. German engineers understood what this meant. They were not facing a superior fighter. They were facing a superior system. Even if Germany could design an aircraft equal to or better than the Thunderbolt, and in some cases it had, the effort was meaningless if it could only be produced in hundreds while the enemy produced thousands. The war in the air had ceased to be a contest of elegance, skill, or even innovation. It had become a contest of throughput, of factories, materials, transportation networks, and trained workers. And in that contest, the Thunderbolt was not the decisive factor. It was the evidence. Clear, undeniable proof that Germany was now fighting a war defined not by tactics, but by industrial mathematics, and those numbers had already sealed the outcome. In the final months of the war, the Thunderbolts at Rechlin sat quietly. Some were still marked with German crosses, parked alongside Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs, in what had become, unintentionally, a museum of captured ambition. When Allied forces overran the facility in 1945, they found filing cabinets filled with reports, thousands of pages documenting every Allied aircraft Germany had examined in painstaking detail. The analysis was thorough, accurate, professional, and useless. German engineers had understood the Thunderbolt completely. They knew its strengths, its weaknesses, its systems, its materials, its performance envelopes. In some cases, they understood American aircraft better than American commanders did. What they lacked was not intelligence. They lacked power. By the time William Roach's Thunderbolt had been dismantled and measured at Rechlin, the war in the air was already decided, not by a single aircraft, not by a single battle, but by an industrial equation Germany could no longer change. Understanding the Thunderbolt did not produce aluminum. It did not rebuild bombed factories. It did not restore fuel supplies or skilled labor. It did not create the alloys required to build turbo superchargers by the thousand. The knowledge arrived too late, and even if it had arrived earlier, it could not have altered the balance. The Thunderbolt was not a miracle weapon. It was not the most elegant fighter of the war. It did not win through brilliance or innovation alone. It won by being good enough and everywhere, built in vast numbers, supported by an industrial system that could replace losses without hesitation, designed with no expectation of scarcity, no fear of material limits, no need to choose between performance and protection. For German pilots, the lesson was brutal. No matter how well they fought, no matter how many victories they claimed, the enemy returned the next day with more aircraft, more fuel, more pilots. The Thunderbolt became a symbol of that reality, not because it was unbeatable, but because it was replaceable. If you found this story worth remembering, consider sharing your thoughts below. Had you heard about German evaluations of the Thunderbolt before? Today? And what other moments from the air war do you think reveal the true cost and meaning of industrial warfare? The men at Rechlin had measured the Thunderbolt perfectly. What they could never measure was the force that built it, and by the time they understood that force, it was already too late.